There was a moment in American history when you could stand at almost any crossroads in this country and hear the distant whistle of a locomotive calling you to adventure. We built the greatest railroad system the world had ever seen, connecting every corner of this vast land with gleaming steel and unstoppable determination. And then, almost as quickly as we built it, we let it slip away. The story begins long before many of us were born, back when the railroad wasn't just a way to travel, but the only way that really mattered. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, America was a nation obsessed with progress, and nothing symbolized that progress quite like the iron horse thundering across the plains. By 1916, we had reached the peak of our ambition. More than 254,000 miles of track connected virtually every town and city worth knowing about. From the wheat fields of Kansas to the orange groves of California, from the coal mines of Pennsylvania to the lumber camps of Washington, steel rails bound this nation together in a web of commerce and human connection. Think about your grandparents or great-grandparents for a moment. When they wanted to visit family across the state or seek opportunity in a distant city, they didn't jump in a car or book a flight. They walked to the local depot, bought a ticket, and climbed aboard a passenger train that would carry them through landscapes they'd only seen in picture books. The railroad wasn't just transportation, it was the thread that stitched together the fabric of American life. It was how young men went off to seek their fortunes and how they brought their brides back home. It was how mail arrived and how goods moved and how news traveled from the big cities to the small towns that dotted the countryside. Every community of any size had its depot, and that depot was often the heart of town. The station master knew everyone by name. He could tell you who was arriving on the afternoon train and who had bought a one-way ticket to somewhere far away. The platform was where people gathered not just to travel, but to see and be seen, to hear the latest gossip, to feel connected to the wider world. When the train pulled in, everything stopped. Storekeepers stepped out onto the sidewalk. Children ran to watch. Farmers paused in their fields to hear that familiar whistle echo across the valley. In the great cities, those stations became monuments to an age that believed in permanence and grandeur. Chicago's Union Station with its soaring Great Hall, Grand Central in New York with its celestial ceiling, Union Station in Los Angeles with its Spanish colonial revival architecture. These weren't just buildings. They were cathedrals of commerce and human connection, where families said tearful goodbyes and joyful hellos, where soldiers shipped off to war and returned as heroes, where dreams departed on schedule and sometimes arrived right on time. Walk into any of these old stations today, and you can still feel the ghosts of countless journeys. The marble floors are worn smooth by millions of footsteps. The wooden benches hold the invisible imprint of waiting travelers from generations past. The announcement board spoke of destinations that sounded exotic, even if they were just one state over. Boston, Atlanta, New Orleans, Denver, Portland, Memphis. Each name was a promise, a possibility, an invitation to step onto a train and become part of something larger than yourself. The Golden Age truly sparkled in the 1940s and 50s, even as the seeds of decline were already being planted. Picture the scene at any major station during those years. Red caps in crisp uniforms hustling with leather suitcases and hat boxes. The smell of diesel fuel and possibility mixing in the air with cigarette smoke and perfume. Announcements echoing through marble halls about departures to anywhere your heart desired. Women wore their Sunday best for train travel, complete with gloves and hats. Men donned suits and ties. Traveling by train was an event, something you dressed up for, something that mattered. The trains themselves were engineering marvels wrapped in Art Deco elegance and streamlined design. The Super Chief racing between Chicago and Los Angeles was more than a train. It was a rolling luxury hotel where movie stars like Judy Garland and Humphrey Bogart mingled with business tycoons. The 20th Century Limited literally unrolled crimson carpet for passengers boarding in New York bound for Chicago. The California Zephyr twisted through the Rockies with its famous Vista Dome cars, where passengers could sit beneath a glass ceiling and feel as if they were flying through the mountains. Imagine settling into one of those dome seats as the train climbed into Colorado, watching the landscape transform from plains to foothills to towering peaks, snow-capped summits, and rushing rivers unfolding like a panoramic movie made just for you. These weren't just trains. They were experiences that defined what it meant to live in a modern, connected America. The dining cars served meals prepared by talented chefs who somehow created culinary magic in swaying kitchens no bigger than a closet. Fresh trout, roast beef, seasonal vegetables, homemade pies served on white tablecloths with fresh flowers in small vases. The observation lounges offered conversation and community in ways that modern travel has completely lost. Strangers became friends over cocktails and shared stories, creating a temporary village where people from different backgrounds shared space and time and experience. Where else in America did that happen so naturally? The sleeping cars transformed into cozy bedrooms where the gentle rocking of the rails lulled you into dreams of tomorrow. The porter, usually an African-American man working for the Pullman Company, would convert your seat into a bed with practiced efficiency, pulling down the upper berth, making up both beds with fresh linens. In the morning, he'd have everything converted back before you finished breakfast. These porters were professionals who took pride in their service, who knew regular passengers by name, who made sure every detail was perfect. Do you remember hearing stories about those days from someone who lived them? But even as these magnificent trains reached their peak of luxury and service, the world was changing in ways that would prove fatal to passenger rail. The year 1956 brought two developments that would reshape American transportation forever. President Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Act, committing the nation to building 41,000 miles of high-speed, limited-access highways. At the same time, commercial aviation was becoming more accessible and affordable to ordinary Americans. The freedom of the open road called to a generation that had grown up during the Depression and war years. Owning a car wasn't just practical. It was a symbol of independence and prosperity. Tangible proof that you had made it. You could leave when you wanted, stop where you pleased, take the scenic route or the direct path. No more checking timetables or rushing to make connections. The highway stretched out before you like an invitation to write your own story. The automobile offered something trains could never match, the ability to go anywhere at any time. Families packed station wagons with luggage and kids and set out on vacations that were themselves adventures. The road trip became an American institution, celebrated in songs and movies and countless family photo albums. Meanwhile, airlines promised something even more revolutionary. Why spend 3 days crossing the country by train when you could fly coast to coast in just 5 hours? The romance of rail travel couldn't compete with the sheer speed and efficiency of jet aircraft. Business travelers were the first to abandon the trains, followed gradually by families and vacationers who discovered that time saved was money earned. The railroads found themselves in an impossible situation. They were required by law to maintain passenger service on many routes, even as ridership plummeted and losses mounted. Between 1947 and 1957 alone, passenger train mileage dropped from 160,000 miles to just 112,000. Railroad companies were losing over $700 million annually on passenger service by the 1950s. They desperately wanted to abandon these money-losing routes, but heavy government regulation made it nearly impossible to do so without lengthy hearings and public protests. Towns that had grown up around railroad stations fought to keep their trains, even as fewer and fewer people actually rode them. Everyone wanted trains to exist, but hardly anyone was willing to ride them anymore. The decline accelerated through the 1960s as one iconic train after another made its final run. The roll call of discontinued services reads like an obituary for an entire way of life. The Olympian Hiawatha, with its distinctive skytop observation car, made its last journey in May of 1961. The Phoebe Snow, the Commodore Vanderbilt, the Golden Triangle, the Bluebird, one by one, they disappeared from the timetables, taking with them not just transportation options, but pieces of American identity. These weren't just business decisions, they were cultural losses that severed connections between communities and erased familiar rhythms from daily life. And then the infrastructure itself began to decay in a slow-motion collapse that was painful to witness. Stations that once gleamed with marble and brass grew shabby and neglected. Paint peeled, windows broke, waiting rooms that once bustled with activity stood empty except for a handful of loyal riders. Equipment aged without replacement. The gleaming streamliners of the 40s and 50s gave way to older, dirtier, less reliable cars pressed back into service. The dining cars that once served gourmet meals started offering pre-packaged sandwiches and instant coffee. White tablecloths disappeared, replaced by paper placemats or nothing at all. The sleeping cars with their crisp linens became dusty and worn, upholstery torn and stained, fixtures broken and unreplaced. What had once been luxury became shabby gentility at best, depressing decay at worst. Service that had once been impeccable grew sporadic and unreliable. Trains ran late, sometimes by hours. Air conditioning failed in summer, heating in winter. It became a vicious cycle where declining quality drove away the few remaining passengers, which led to even more cuts in service, which drove away even more passengers. Each cut made the next cut inevitable. By the late 1960s, it was clear that something had to change, or passenger rail service in America would disappear entirely. In 1970, Congress passed the Rail Passenger Service Act, creating the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, which we know today as Amtrak. On May 1, 1971, Amtrak took over most of the remaining intercity passenger trains in the country. It was meant to be a rescue, a way to preserve at least some semblance of the great network that had once united the nation. But here's the thing about rescue missions. Sometimes they save the patient, and sometimes they just prolong the decline. Amtrak inherited a patchwork of aging equipment, deteriorating track, and routes that had been bleeding money for years. The new corporation immediately cut the network down to just over half of what it had been, eliminating hundreds of trains and leaving entire regions without passenger rail service. The comprehensive network we'd spent a century building was suddenly full of gaps and holes. Towns that had depended on rail connections found themselves isolated. The station your grandparents knew, where they met their sweethearts or said goodbye to children leaving for college, might have been boarded up or converted into a restaurant or museum. Some became antique shops or community centers. Others were simply demolished. The tracks themselves, in many places, were pulled up and sold for scrap. Entire rail lines were abandoned, left to be slowly reclaimed by nature or converted into hiking trails. Over 60,000 miles of track disappeared in the decades following Amtrak's creation. What's particularly poignant is that many of these abandoned lines represented incomplete dreams. All across the country, you can still find the remnants of railroads that were started but never finished, victims of economic panics, shifting priorities, or changing times. The Wyoming North and South Railroad graded over 100 miles and laid 45 miles of track in the 1920s, dreaming of connecting Canada to Colorado. It operated for just 12 years before being abandoned, its embankments still visible across the Wyoming prairie like scars on the landscape. The Danbury and Harlem Traction Company spent 10 years building an electric rail line through Connecticut and New York, laying track almost all the way to its destination. Then the money ran out, and the project died incomplete. Dozens of similar stories played out across the nation. Ambitious plans, partial construction, ultimate abandonment. Even more heartbreaking are the modern attempts to revive passenger rail that never quite materialized. Grand visions of high-speed rail connecting major cities, regional networks serving growing metropolitan areas, restored service to communities that lost their trains decades ago. Planning documents gather dust, feasibility studies sit on shelves, proposed routes remain nothing more than lines on maps. The political will, the funding, the public support all prove elusive. Think about what we lost when we let this network slip away. It wasn't just the trains themselves or even the economic benefits of passenger rail. We lost a particular way of experiencing America, a slower and more contemplative mode of travel that let you see the country unfold mile by mile outside your window. You could watch the landscape change gradually, see how the architecture shifted from region to region, observe how people dressed differently and talked differently as you moved across the map. Air travel turned America into a series of airports that all look the same. Driving turned it into a blur of highways and rest stops. Only the train let you really see the country. We lost the community that formed among strangers sharing a journey. On a train, you had time to talk, time to share stories, time to discover that the stranger across from you had something interesting to say. You might learn about farming from a man who worked the land in Nebraska, hear about fishing from a woman whose family had worked the boats off Maine for generations. The train was a mobile classroom in American life and culture. We also lost practical transportation options. Not everyone can afford a car or is able to drive. Not everyone lives near an airport or can navigate the complexities of modern air travel. Passenger trains used to connect small towns and big cities in a network that made mobility accessible to all Americans. When we abandoned that network, we abandoned people who depended on it. The freight railroads, ironically, remain robust and efficient. American freight rail is among the best in the world, moving goods across the continent with remarkable effectiveness. But passenger service, which once defined American railroading, has become a pale shadow of its former glory. Outside the Northeast Corridor between Washington and Boston, Amtrak trains often run on freight railroad tracks, subject to delays and relegated to second priority. The service is inconsistent, the equipment often outdated, the coverage incomplete. Other nations have made different choices. Japan built its bullet trains and revolutionized transportation. France developed the TGV system that connects its cities with high-speed service. China has constructed tens of thousands of miles of modern passenger rail in just a few decades. Meanwhile, America, the country that pioneered railroad technology and built the most extensive network in the world, struggles to maintain even basic passenger service in most regions. We talk periodically about building high-speed rail, about modernizing our infrastructure, about connecting our cities with efficient passenger trains. But somehow, the plans never quite come to fruition. The network we almost completed represents more than just abandoned track and discontinued trains. It represents a vision of America that we chose not to pursue. We decided that individual automobiles and air travel better suited our values of independence and efficiency. Perhaps that was the right choice, or perhaps we're only now beginning to realize what we gave up in exchange for that freedom. The rails are still there in many places, rusting quietly beneath overgrown weeds, or converted to trails where cyclists now ride, where locomotives once thundered. Every abandoned station, every pulled-up track, every discontinued route represents a choice we made as a nation. We chose highways over railways, speed over scenery. The America that built the greatest rail network the world had ever seen is not the same America that let it slip away. Which version do you remember? Tell us about your railroad memories. Railroad.